Every single day, in spaces you probably consider perfectly safe, your brain is being systematically hacked. Seriously. We tend to think of mind control as this sort of sci-fi movie trope, right? Or maybe something relegated to fringe groups, isolated way out in some remote compound. But the architecture of undue influence is actually woven directly into the fabric of our modern society. Today, we're going completely under the hood of psychological coercion to map out exactly how human autonomy gets bypassed through systemic control. Because the very tools designed to hijack your critical thinking, they are likely operating in your digital feeds, your workplace, and honestly, maybe even your relationships right now.
Look, you've likely said it and you've definitely heard it. It is what it is. It sounds so stoic, doesn't it? But it's actually a highly effective psychological weapon. It's designed to instantly bypass independent thinking and just completely shut down logical analysis. When someone drops this phrase into a conversation, the analytical part of your brain literally hits a brick wall. It compresses a complex, frustrating reality into an unquestionable rule, leaving absolutely zero room for dissent or any further investigation.
So, back in 1961, psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton coined the absolute perfect term for this. He called it the thought-terminating cliché. Think of them as semantic stop signs. And what's truly fascinating is just how universally they get weaponized. I mean, everyone from holistic wellness influencers trying to rationalize away a medical critique, all the way up to political leaders dismissing valid dissent, they all utilize these catchy platitudes to compress the most far-reaching and complex human problems into these brief, definitive-sounding phrases. And here is why they are so incredibly dangerous. When they repeat it enough, they capitalize on a cognitive bias known as the illusory truth effect. Through sheer repetition, these cliches become the absolute start and finish of any ideological analysis.
To really understand this, we can look at Stephen Hassan's BITE model, which maps out the 4 architectural pillars of authoritarian control. That's behavior, information, thought, and emotion. To systematically dismantle critical thinking, a system first has to regulate physical reality and behavior, usually through strict rewards and punishments. That physical regulation then allows them to control and compartmentalize information, ensuring you only ever see carefully curated insider doctrine. Once that information is walled off, the system manipulates thought by instilling a really rigid us versus them mentality, and relying heavily on those thought-terminating cliches we just unpacked. Finally, the whole structure gets locked into place through emotion. They induce profound guilt, fear, and literally a phobia of ever leaving the group.
But here is the wild part. We don't actually need physical isolation anymore to achieve that behavioral and informational control. Social media platforms have essentially become the ultimate new frontier for cult-like psychological entrapment. Think about the stark contrast here. Instead of dragging followers out to a remote physical compound in the woods, the modern feed acts as an invisible, algorithmic compound. It isolates users ideologically, feeding them highly targeted, emotionally charged information, while effectively and entirely invisibly walling off any contradicting viewpoints.
And academia is currently quantifying this exact phenomenon. There's this fascinating thesis out of the University of Gothenburg that measures the digital cult of personality. It breaks down how a social media influencer utilizes 4 distinct elements. First, a dedicated base of followers. Second, a clear driving mission. Third, the institutionalization of a group identity through unique symbols and insider language. And fourth, patrimonialism, which is basically a hierarchical, unquestioning loyalty directly to the leader. When an influencer combines a dedicated mission with that insider language, researchers found it directly manipulates the base's brand perception and wildly drives up their purchase intention. So the audience's devotion is literally being monetized.
We can also observe these exact digital mechanics being deployed for ideological radicalization. Political psychology researchers note the deployment of cold-style manipulation, specifically using digital organizing to create highly insular youth movements. For example, researchers document how figures like Nick Fuentes build an online base to enforce rigid authoritarianism and white nationalism by leveraging coded language. This creates that rigid insider versus outsider doctrine. The digital ecosystem allows for rapid, widespread radicalization using the exact same structural architecture and psychological hooks that were historically reserved for isolated fringe sects.
Okay, let's pivot for a second. The architecture of control isn't solely found in political extremism or digital influencer spaces. Let's shift our lens over to the corporate world. We're going to look at how the exact same psychological architecture is deployed, somewhat ironically, under the guise of financial freedom and the classic American dream.
Take just a second to process this number, $90 billion. That is the massive worldwide valuation of the multi-level marketing industry. This isn't some fringe economic anomaly, right? It is a global financial juggernaut, and it operates by systematically utilizing the very mechanics of undue influence we've been decoding, proving just how incredibly profitable commercialized coercion can really be.
So modern MLMs utilize structural undue influence that actually evolved straight from the door-to-door sales tactics of the Great Depression. Through something called inventory loading, the salesperson is actually the primary customer, constantly buying wholesale goods they often can't even sell. These companies enforce strict recruitment mandates and utilize top-loaded compensation plans where only a fraction of a percent at the very top ever make a profit. They aren't just selling soap or leggings, they are selling an ideology. And if you fail, well, the system is designed to make you believe it is entirely your fault, heavily weaponizing guilt and shame to keep participants completely trapped, both financially and psychologically.
So we've scaled this from macro-level organizations down to digital networks to massive corporate structures. Now let's scale the concept down to the absolute interpersonal level, because the terrifying truth here is that it only takes one single person to build a cult. A bad relationship, specifically in the context of domestic abuse, utilizes the exact same tools of coercive control.
At the interpersonal level, control really relies on creating what clinical psychologist Dr. Craig Newman calls an abusive unreality. In narrative regulation therapy, we see exactly how an abuser imposes a forced narrative onto a victim through grooming and gaslighting. Over time, the victim internalizes the blame, leading to a profound psychological adaptation known as FOGS. That stands for fear, obligation, guilt, and shame. And look, this isn't just sadness. It's a reactive over-reliance on limited emotions that actively binds the victim to the abuser. It effectively locks the door of their psychological prison entirely from the inside.
Dr. Newman maps out this 5-stage framework for recovery, but honestly, the vital takeaway here is that recovery is rarely linear. Because survivors face major post-relational external threats, things like ongoing legal manipulation or parental alienation, they often bounce back and forth between these stages. True recovery goes so far beyond just a single moment of leaving. It requires systematically unlearning the abuser's coercive control, resolving profound attachment injuries, and constantly managing external risks before deep trauma processing can even effectively begin.
All right, so we've mapped these really compelling frameworks across multiple facets of society, from cults and social media to MLMs and domestic abuse. But true critical thinking requires us to turn the analytical lens back onto the models themselves. Within clinical psychology and academia, the actual scientific validity of models like BITE is the subject of fierce, ongoing debate.
It's really divided. Proponents argue Stephen Hassan's model provides vital, observable behaviors for evaluating real-world harm. They say it's highly useful in legal settings involving things like human trafficking or domestic control. However, academic critics fiercely push back. Sociologists like Massimo and Trovini labeled a model as pseudoscience that lacks rigorous peer review. They argue the indicators are so incredibly broad that they end up pathologizing perfectly normal group behaviors, meaning it could theoretically be weaponized against any religion or political party the user just happens to dislike. Critics suggest these models serve the interests of moral entrepreneurs rather than actually advancing objective scholarly understanding.
Which brings us to our final and perhaps most important consideration of this entire explainer. Whether you view these mechanisms as rigid scientific formulas or just broad sociological observations, the underlying architecture of persuasion is undeniably acting upon you every single day. Your attention and your autonomy are highly valuable commodities. So I'll leave you with this challenge. Look closely at the language used in your digital feeds by the leaders in your workplace and within your own personal relationships. Are you making truly independent choices? Or are unseen systems of control quietly terminating your critical thought? Keep your eyes open and absolutely never stop questioning.